When it comes to modern video games, none hold a candle to the storytelling and strategy demanded of the modern RPG genre. That genre owes a great deal of its existence to the Final Fantasy franchise, and in turn, the Final Fantasy franchise would not exist today if not for a company gambling on one game designer. That designer is Hironobu Sakaguchi, the man who would become better known to the world as the father of Final Fantasy. His dedication to his dream saw the company Square and his position within it grow. His tenacity to see that dream through took the Final Fantasy franchise from a last-ditch effort to save the company to a multi-million-dollar franchise that established the RPG genre as a mainstream source of art and entertainment. His accomplishments in games each furthered video games and the RPG genre in different ways that should be examined. We'll look into his early efforts to produce the first Final Fantasy, the improvements and introductions of the continued franchise, and the events which led to him leaving the franchise and the company for good. As with any good story or role-playing game, we should start from the beginning. Though initially a part-timer, Hironobu Sakaguchi began his career with the then-named company Square in 1986 as a game designer. While his initial games proved unsuccessful, he pushed for the company to release a role-playing game after the success of their competitor Enix's game, Dragon Quest, as per the Japan's Platinum Game Chart. With the company facing bankruptcy, Sakaguchi was given the go-ahead to create his own role-playing game for the Famicom to rival Dragon Quest. As a final Hail Mary for Square and for Sakaguchi himself, it was generally assumed that failure would mean the end of the company and his video game career. Luckily for the designer and company both, that potential game over was avoided with what would be the first of a long line of Final Fantasy games, finding success with over 500,000 copies sold as told to Electronic Gaming Monthly in 1994. With the first game offering the happy ending that Square needed, it should not come as a surprise that Sakaguchi was given the go-ahead to begin work on a sequel, and the franchise was born. Now, any good sequel should introduce something new, something interesting to the story that it's continuing, and almost every Final Fantasy game produced under the guidance of Sakaguchi has introduced something significant both to the name and to the genre as a whole. We're just going to look at a few of the more important games to the franchise and to Sakaguchi himself. Now, Final Fantasy III introduced the now coveted job system to the genre, allowing players a much greater expanse on how they can design their characters for combat, and added the idea of strategy in RPGs, in general, as no two character parties needed to look the same for the end of the game. Now, Final Fantasy IV was the first step onto the newly released Super Famicom system, and used the stronger system to expand its size across the board. The job system was set aside temporarily to focus more on character personality and growth, and the world now existed across multiple layers and maps with multiple merging story points. The vehicle mechanic that had been introduced in the first Final Fantasy was actually expanded upon as well, with numerous vehicles now having different purposes both for story and practical purposes. Final Fantasy VI found Sakaguchi not as the director, but the producer and story writer of the game. With over a dozen characters with their own various story arcs, personalities, and backgrounds, and game styles to manage across two worlds, with a plot that involved political intrigue and ancient warfare, Final Fantasy VI actually pushed the Super Famicom to its very brink as far as its memory and processing power was capable. It also introduced to the franchise the idea of desperation attacks, which allowed last-ditch efforts for a player to save an otherwise unwinnable situation. Now, Final Fantasy VII, what it did for Square and for the RPG genre is something that should be an entire essay on its own, but for now just a brief summary. The game brought the franchise to the PlayStation on 3 discs, which was the largest on the system at the time. It brought 3D character models, symphony orchestras, environmentalism, and emotional scenes that still scar players to this day, as well as a modern take on a game style that had been almost exclusively medieval fantasy basically since its conception. Now, Final Fantasy X was the last flagship Final Fantasy that Sakaguchi produced, and it proved one last time that he still had it. This game brought the franchise to the PlayStation 2, did away with the leveling system that had been in place since Final Fantasy III, and explored new heights in terms of technology and music for the genre. It was also the first Final Fantasy to have a direct sequel, continuing the story of previously played characters and seeing what happens after the happily ever after screen. Now, 17 years of creating Final Fantasy games that were always meant to be the last. The day finally came for Hironobu Sakaguchi to see the credits roll on his time with the amazing franchise he had created. A series of events did lead Sakaguchi to leave the company, starting with him being the film director for the critically panned Final Fantasy Spirits Within movie, which saw Square take a hefty financial loss as documented in the Vice. This saw Sakaguchi step down as the executive vice president of Square, or one of their vice presidents rather, which was a position he had come to earn due to his many great feats for the company. He then took his new opportunity, with the support of Microsoft Game Studios, to create the new company Mistwalker, which is where he is now, still creating role-playing games across various platforms. Now, though the Final Fantasy franchise continues to push the envelope for the RPG genre, without the hand and mind of its creator and father, it got to where it was with the hard work and love of Sakaguchi. Now, we have reflected on the works and achievements of Hironobu Sakaguchi, his early works to produce the first Final Fantasy, the improvements and introduction that the series created, and the events that led to him leaving the franchise. Today, the Final Fantasy franchise has reached its 15th iteration. Final Fantasy VII, continued by many as one of Sakaguchi's greatest accomplishments, has received countless accolades for its story and value to the world as both a game and a form of art, and has recently had a remake released as the third best-selling game of the year and the single best-selling Final Fantasy of all time. We all dream of grand aspirations for our children, but when it comes to Hironobu Sakaguchi, he didn't want just dreams. He wanted a Final Fantasy. Thank you very much.